Welcome to the deep dive. Ever feel like the secret to real change isn't about those huge, dramatic moments, but maybe it's hidden in, the quiet, everyday stuff, the small things?
Exactly. And today we're going to dig right into that idea. We're drawing on a really interesting mix of ancient astrology and a pretty powerful modern story.
Yeah, it sounds like quite the combination. So the core idea is about harnessing our energy, right,
Mm.
for self-improvement.
Right. Self-improvement, positive change. But the key is how. It's about being meticulous, thoughtful, not just busy for the sake of being busy. Our goal here is to pull out some, practical wisdom, how to refine what you're doing, maybe fix things that aren't quite working, and get yourself aligned for, well, maximum impact, both in your own life and maybe even out in the world.
Okay, and importantly, avoiding those common traps like burnout or getting bogged down in tiny details.
Precisely. We want to help you navigate those pitfalls.
So the sources for this deep dive for June 17th, 2025, you said astrology and the story.
That's right. We've got an astrological reading looking at Mars moving into Virgo, and then there's this narrative called The Weaver of Small Things. They seem distinct, but you'll see how they connect beautifully.
Interesting. Okay, let's start with the astrology then. Mars shifting into Virgo. What does that signify?
Well, this transit, it runs from June 17th to August 6th, and the description calls it a sudden shift. A shift toward productivity, efficiency, focus, discipline, even self-improvement. It brings this very grounded, practical, industrious energy.
Industrious. So good for detailed work, refining things.
Absolutely. Perfect for that. Refining skills, detailed projects, even focusing on health and wellness routines. But it's less about just churning things out. It's more about intentional action. That's the key.
Intentionality. That word really jumps out. How does this energy actually guide us to apply that? Beyond just like ticking off a to-do list, does it mean we should slow down a bit, even with all this productivity push?
It does, actually. Yeah. The guidance suggests we can and maybe should stop to breathe, have those heartfelt conversations without feeling like, oh no, I'm wasting time.
Ah, okay. So productivity doesn't mean shutting people out.
Not at all. There's a call for open-hearted listening to ease tension. So yes, it's industrious, but it's also mindful, a human approach. The mantra that comes up for this period is refine, repair, and realign.
Refine, repair, realign. Okay.
Yeah. It directs our focus to the details, our habits, the systems we use, and of course, efficiency.
The source material also mentions something called sacred maintenance of life, treating everyday actions like a ritual, focusing on what's necessary, not flashy, moving with intention, not tension. What makes it sacred? Why not just call it routine?
That's a great question. And I think the sacred part is crucial. It becomes sacred because you infuse it with purpose, with like a reverence for the process itself, not just the end result.
Okay, so it's about the care you put in.
Exactly. It suggests that taking your time, being intentional, getting things right the first time, that actually pays off more than rushing. And if we connect this to, say, facing obstacles or frustration, the idea is to use your head, that analytical Virgo energy, instead of just reacting with anger. The text even uses this powerful phrase, the warrior becomes the healer.
The warrior becomes the healer, not through fighting, though.
Right. Not through grand battles, but through devotion. Devotion to what's useful, what's ethical, what's real. Quiet service, almost.
So this isn't just about organizing your desk or optimizing your schedule. It feels bigger. I noticed a strong mention of championing rights for women, for anyone feeling ignored. How does this efficient detail energy connect to social issues?
Yeah, it definitely extends outwards. That Mars and Virgo energy, it also sharpens our focus on justice and equity, especially for those who are often overlooked. It suggests that applying the same refined, meticulous approach to, say, systemic problems advocating for the disenfranchised can be a powerful form of healing.
Ah, so it's like applying that repair and realign mantra to societal structures.
Precisely. Recognizing where things are neglected, where they're out of alignment in the bigger picture, and then applying that same diligent, intentional effort. And this focus on quiet, intentional action. It actually brings us perfectly to that story you mentioned earlier.
Right, the weaver of small things. Eira,
Yeah, yes.
tell us about her. What was her role? She wasn't a typical leader, was she?
No, not at all. She was known as the weaver of small things, and she embodied this quiet power, not by, shouting from the rooftops or leading armies. Her tools were her needle and thread. She'd light rosemary incense, sit at her loom, but this loom wove invisible threads.
Invisible threads, what did they represent?
Each thread was like a person in the town, or a habit, a tradition, even a system they all relied on.
So she wasn't tackling the big, obvious crises. She was focused on the subtle stuff. the things happening underneath.
Exactly that. Eira understood something profound, that communities, maybe even lives, don't usually collapse because of one giant disaster. It's more often the small things, the neglected promises, the unspoken resentments, the little injustices that pile up. Those are the things that cause the slow unraveling.
The tiny phrase that eventually weaken the whole fabric.
Yeah. So she took on this task of, well, sacred maintenance herself. She'd refine those threads, repair the small tears, realign things that were getting tangled.
The story gives examples, right?
Yeah.
Like gently loosening knots in old, outdated system.
Mm-hmm. Or leaving a bit of lemon balm for an overworked mother. Weaving patience into conversations where maybe elders were being judgmental.
That sounds like, well, like work most people wouldn't even notice, or maybe dismiss as insignificant.
Right. But Era knew better. Her actions, though small and often unseen at first, were actually laying the groundwork for something much bigger, because eventually this ominous tension did start to settle over the town. Roads cracked, tempers flared, systems started failing.
All because of that cumulative neglect, that focus on the superficial instead of the foundational.
That's how the story frames it. And Era saw these huge, tangled knots forming from all this neglect.
And that's when she stepped up more visibly. She gathered the town's women.
Yes. The women who were often overlooked themselves, right? And she taught them to weave. But not literally with needles. They wove with intention. They focused together on this ritual of sacred maintenance.
What did that look like for them as a group?
Well, they started repairing abandoned homes. They worked on mending broken friendships. They actively created space and gave voice and shelter to those who felt pushed aside, the disenfranchised.
So practical actions, but driven by that deeper intention.
Exactly. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't an overnight fix. But the story says it worked. The town began to heal. Not through some big conflict or heroic battle, but through this quiet restoration. Through these daily acts of devotion to fairness, health, equity, compassion.
And Eira's key teaching was not to weaponize perfection.
Right. To move with intention and heart, not with like rigid, judgmental fixing.
Which brings up a really important warning from the story, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It says something like, fixing what no one asked them to fix wasn't a virtue, it was a distraction.
Mm.
How does that connect back to the astrological warnings about Mars and Virgo?
Oh, that's a perfect connection. Because that Mars and Virgo energy, as potent as it is for getting things done right, it comes with some strong cautions. The astrological source specifically warns against weaponizing perfectionism or micromanaging others.
Ah, so that drive for efficiency can turn sour.
It really can. Judgment can creep in. Impatience with others who aren't, up to standard. There's a real risk of obsessing over tiny details that don't matter, or, like the story says, jumping in to fix things nobody asked you to fix, which just becomes a huge distraction from what really needs attention.
And the astrology also warned that things left neglected will break down if we haven't been paying attention to the small signs, right?
Yes, so there's a tension there. You need to pay attention to details and maintenance.
But not obsessively, or impose your standards on everyone else. It's about finding the right focus.
Exactly. Discerning what genuinely needs attention and also knowing when to step back, when not to overdo it. It's a balance.
And what happens if we miss that balance? What's the ultimate pitfall here?
Well, the source points to overworking, overthinking, or trying to control every outcome, which inevitably leads to nervous exhaustion, frustration, burnout. We've all felt that, right?
Absolutely.
And Eira's story gives us such a beautiful counterpoint. It shows how to avoid that trap by focusing on that collective, intentional, sacred maintenance. It's about seeing what truly needs tending and doing it with heart rather than falling into that individual kind of weaponized perfectionism.
Okay, so pulling this all together then, this deep dive seems to show how that focused, industrious energy of Mars and Virgo and the wisdom from Eira, the weaver of small things, they both point to the same core idea, that real meaningful change doesn't always come from the big, loud gestures.
No, it comes from that consistent, intentional tending, that sacred maintenance of the often overlooked small things.
So what's the main takeaway for someone listening? What should they hold on to?
I think it's this powerful dual message, really. A call to action. Yes, be efficient, be organized, use that focused energy, but always do it with heart. Avoid that trap of weaponized perfectionism. Avoid the burnout that comes from trying to control everything. Ultimately, it's about embodying that idea of the healer, not through conflict, but through that quiet, devoted tending, paying attention to what's useful, what's ethical, what's real.
So as we wrap up, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. Consider that philosophy in your own life, maybe in your work, your relationships, or even your wider community. What are the small things there? What habits, what connections, what maybe neglected systems or quiet injustices? What's calling out for your intentional refinement, repair, and realignment? How could you, perhaps, like Eira, become a different kind of healer? Not through battling problems head on necessarily, but through that devoted, quiet tending of what truly matters, something to mull over.